Everyone, thanks for joining us. I'm Ryan Stubbs. I'm Senior Director of Research at the National Assembly of State Arts Agencies, or NASAA. And I'm excited for today's conversation and wanted to provide an overview of our agenda as we get started. So I'm going to briefly talk about a couple of NASA resources relevant to our conversation today. And then we'll hear from Moshe Rhodes, NASAA's research manager, to look at some highlights from the latest arts and cultural production satellite account data and NASAA's Creative Economy state profiles. We'll then hear from Professor Doug Noonan from the University of Indiana, Indianapolis, about his research showing how the arts contribute to economic growth. And then we'll have a conversation between Professor Noonan and Sunil Iyengar, director of the NEA's Office of Research and Analysis, to discuss and reflect on the research. And we'll also try to get to any questions at the end, or answer at least a few questions at the end. So feel free to type questions in the chat as we're talking and during the learning series presentation. And we have a lot to get to, so let's go ahead and get into it. So I'm going to start by talking about a couple of NASA resources that I think are additive to the conversation and provide some perspective, especially for state arts agencies. So last summer, NASA, in cooperation with the NEA, conducted research into how we might improve our creative economy dashboards and resources. This research highlights some of the continued challenges that states, advocates, and others have in communicating about the economic value of the arts. And I think the problem isn't a lack of data resources. There are numerous studies and opportunities to communicate about the economic value of the arts in many contexts. However, there's less clarity around which resources work best for which situation. And at NASA, we're data omnivores, and I think the more resources and data that are available on this topic, the better. But I wanted to briefly point out a couple of resources that may help you navigate and contextualize creative economy research. So I'll share my screen here. And first, you will see the NASA Creative Economy webpage. And I'm going to go ahead and post that into the chat. And this is a great starting place to get to some of NASAA's resources here. And the thing I wanted to point out in particular, just right now, is our interactive database of state creative economy studies. And this is something that we've been doing for quite some time in cooperation with the NEA. And this research, or this resource actually just underwent an update. And thanks to NASAA's research associate, Declan Wicks, it now draws on over 165 studies across 48 states. And the tool allows anyone to review and mine current and historical state creative economy research approaches. And I think one takeaway from this is that there are many valid ways that states approach this research. So just to give some basics around the navigation, we can look at studies over years. We can select particular states. We can look at particular studies that states have done, and then there are hyperlinks to those studies. So looking at different states, looking at different studies, we can get some basic information about them and also get to those resources. So I think it's a valuable way to look at the many different approaches that are used across states. Also, I can just get to the next thing here. I also wanted to mention a new policy brief that speaks to some of the frequently asked questions that state arts agencies and others have around creative economy research. And a few key takeaways from this brief is that first, there's no one definition of the creative economy. It also points out some of the differences between studies, including the ACPSA, and discusses some of the practical reasons why it's good to have multiple resources and methods. So with that, I will stop sharing my screen and pass it over to Moshe Rhodes to talk about some more NASA resources.
Yes, the ACPSA data in particular. I'm going to share my screen. Oh, you saw my you saw my Slack chats. Okay, so Ryan did bring you to the creative economy page, but you get there from the from the homepage at NASA. You go to research, and under research, you click on creative economy. And under creative economy data, creative economy state profiles. And this is our website that houses the ACPSA data, the Arts and Cultural Production Satellite Account data. And I'll briefly go over this website and I'll use some examples. As Ryan discussed, the policy brief is the first link here. I encourage everyone to look at that to understand the context of the data and how the data can be used. We also have a link to some data on US territories, and we have a link to NEA and BEA data, and I'll get back to that at the end. So the first part of the website features a little bit of language about the data, the partnership between the NEA and the BEA, and some definitions. Then we get to the map, and it always starts with the nation, but you can select any state as well as the United States. And you can select various data, value added, employment, and compensation. So you can look at 3 different data types. And the map is nice as you can click on a state and get their full data profile. And you can also just hover over states and get some highlights. So you can compare states and so forth and so on. So for the United States, the first data presented are some of the highlights. The value added, which when you hover over some of these terms, they're defined. So value added is defined as an industry's total market value of goods and services. And so for 2022, which is the most recent data set that we have, the ACPSA data, that's around 1 trillion. And that represents around 4.3% of total GDP. And it's also broken down by core arts and supporting arts, and you can hover over these terms for the definitions. Next, we have how the ACPSA, how the arts and culture data sector compares to other industries within the US, and here it ranks second under retail and above construction and transportation. Scrolling a little bit down, you can get data and information on the various industries within the ACPSA data set. We can get trends over time for top 5 industries, and we can also get trends comparing the ACPSA with GDP trends. I'm going to feature a couple of states that we know have used the data, and so we can put some of these data into context. So first, I'm going to start with Vermont. And Vermont, the ACPSA is the 3rd largest sector in Vermont. Scrolling down to the industries, if we look at value added, the largest industry in Vermont are public cultural institutions. And another interesting way to look at the data is through location quotients. And the definition is the measurement of an industry's concentration to the national share. So what that means is if it's above 1, that state has a higher concentration of that industry relative to the United States as a whole. So here we can see, if we click on location quotient for Vermont, the custom architectural woodwork and metalwork manufacturing, there's a much larger concentration of this industry in Vermont than the US as a whole. And we know that Vermont has used the data in budget testimony and conversations, not necessarily this piece that I'm showing you here, but we know in general they have used the data in budget testimony and conversations with legislators, and state officials themselves are sharing the data. So the next example is Pennsylvania that I'll highlight. We know that Pennsylvania have used the data in a press release on the significance of the creative sector's contributions to GDP. And so for Pennsylvania, the ACPSA ranks 4th in comparison industries. In terms of industries, broadcasting is the largest in terms of value added, the largest industry in Pennsylvania. And in terms of concentration, industry concentration, it's highly concentrated in education services, far more than the nation as a whole. My last example is Georgia. Georgia, the ACPSA ranks 4th amongst selected industries. Its largest industry is also broadcasting in terms of value added. And in terms of concentration, it's highly concentrated in motion pictures above the national average as well. And we know that Georgia has used data to help the Arts Agency and the overall Department of Economic Development in which the agency is situated. It helps these two entities understand how the creative sector plays a role in the economy. And the one last thing I wanted to show here is when you select a state, it will also give you the regional comparison. So for Georgia, we know that in terms of value added, it ranks 2nd in terms of value added in the region, just under Florida. So I wanted to finish by highlighting by paying attention, by calling out resources from the NEA, which are great. So we have a link. And if you click on the link, it'll bring you to the ACPSA data. There's a bunch of different links on the left to reports, to data tables, to raw data tables, to data for the US. And there's also a wonderful little interactive visual that can give you visuals and statistics on industries. So I encourage everyone to look at these resources. They're great. And then if you click up above here at the Arts Data Profile Series, you get all the various references to different data sets. And if you click on state level estimates, these are wonderful fact sheets within here, wonderful fact sheets from the PEA. But first we have also a wonderful little image here. You can click on a state and it'll give you some nice high level statistics of that state. And if you click to the left, state fact sheets by the BEA, it will bring you to a download. And you can download all the fact sheets for all the states. And these fact sheets are great. They're little 2-pagers of various data and statistics and graphs. And they're wonderful, and you can access all of them. And that is the end of my presentation.
Great. So I think now we are ready for Doug. Take it away, Doug.
All right, thank you. Let me try to switch over and share my slides and find it. Had it a moment ago. All right, someone let me know if the slides aren't up, but thank you, Ryan. I'm thrilled to be here. I'm going to try to be quick for a couple of reasons. One, you can get the report that I'm going to briefly summarize. It's up online. You can read it at your leisure, but also I can't wait to get to the conversation with Sunil at the end. One of my favorite parts about the ACPSA as a data set is the conversations that it spurs, and it'll get us thinking and hopefully having some fruitful conversations. So what did I do with this study? Well, the key findings here, I took a look at the ACPSA at the state level for all 50 states plus DC across the last 21 years, from 2001 to 2021, and tried to see what kind of patterns we could pull out of that data. And so the big findings here, first, perhaps to the surprise of no one, the arts sector declined in 2020, and the arts and culture sector declined in a big way, but so did the rest of the economy. The interesting part is how quickly it recovered, and its recovery in 2021 was even faster than the overall economy. Analytically, the more interesting part, I think, and the bit of a surprise to me, was seeing how the state's arts and culture sector can be shown to be driving their state's overall economy in a causal sense. So in a way, it is a leading indicator, or it is a driver of state economic growth. The data would show that it's a modest effect, but it's statistically significant. A 10% increase in your state's overall arts and cultural sector, a 10% increase in 1 year, would predict a 0.8%, almost a 1% increase in the overall state gross state product in the following year. That's not a small effect. It's not huge, but it's small. It's a real and it's positive one. And an interesting part to this was that the catalyst behind this are these core industries, the core subsectors of the arts and culture economy. It's not the supporting part. It's not construction or IT. It's actually coming from those that are making the content and the ideas behind it. So it's a really nice affirmation of the importance of that creative economy. The makeup of that creative economy, I think one of the most dramatic parts that you can see when you get into the ACPS state data is how much the composition of the creative economy has changed in the last 20 years. A lot of these changes are in line with what we experienced during the pandemic, but these changes were afoot before the pandemic. That merely accelerated these changes. And I'll get into in a minute and help visualize some of the changes in the overall creative economy that we've experienced in the last 2 decades. And then the last thing I wanted to emphasize here is that from a state level perspective, sort of your mileage may vary. What I'll show here are the averages across all the states and the aggregate patterns across the states. Within the states, or I should say among the states, their individual state level experiences with their arts and culture sector vary profoundly from state to state. So you can see these in the great tools that Mojo just showed, just by moving that cursor over different states. Some states are not just sort of have a relatively larger arts and culture sector than other states, but what goes into those arts and culture sectors varies dramatically from state to state. And that's one of the more interesting defining characteristics of our creative economy in the US, is that there's a great deal of diversity there. And I think that makes it exciting field to work in, but also from my perspective, an exciting thing to study. So if we look at these big level trends, here's a graph of the last 20 some odd years in the gross state product, the thin blue line there. And everything's been normalized in this graph to 2001 at a starting point of 1. So you can see by 2021, we've got about a 90% increase in the overall gross state product over those 20 years. And then the thick red line here is the arts and culture sector's piece of that, the value added that comes to it, comes from the arts and culture sector. And you can see both the overall economy and the arts and culture sector took a big hit in the Great Recession, but then bounced back, and the growth, these things roughly track alongside each other pretty well. And then pandemic hits and we see a big downturns in 2020, but then an even more rapid upturn as this gap that you could see in 2019 has been closed by 2021, and we're roughly back on that same trajectory. Now I wanted to decompose this sort of monolithic arts and culture sector a bit. So using that core arts and supporting arts distinction that's in the ACPSA, I've split that arts and culture sector up into these 2 pieces, where the core arts, those content and creative ideas piece that is in the dark red dotted line, and then the supporting arts, which is actually the much larger piece, is in the thinner green dotted line underneath. And again, both of these are roughly tracking along with the overall size of the economy in terms of GDP or gross state product in this case. But one thing I would notice is out of the core parts of the arts and culture sector, it's a bit more volatile. There was a bigger decline in the Great Recession, and certainly a much, much bigger decline in the core arts sector during the pandemic year of 2020, especially relative to the overall economy and the supporting part of the arts and culture sector, but then also an even more dramatic rebound effect. And overall, over the course of the last 20 years, the core subsectors of the arts and culture sector have been growing at an even faster rate than the overall economy. We can get into this perhaps more in the discussion, but there are some interesting data in there about compensation and employment. And this dark green line shows the total amount of compensation paid in the arts and culture sector divided by the number of arts and culture jobs. And you can see that it didn't even suffer a decline during the 2020 pandemic year. And that's in large part not because compensation was booming during that time, but because the number of jobs took such a big hit. And so the numerator stayed fairly consistent, but the denominator took a big decline in it. So the compensation per job took a fall. But if you compare it to median household income, this red line, you can see that over the last 20 years, compensation in the ACPSA data per arts job has actually been growing faster than the overall household income in the US and the overall economy. All right, I want to decompose this a bit more, so bear with me on these visuals. Here's the sort of size on the left, the size of the arts and culture sector in 2001, and the two wedges of this pie broken down between the smaller core subsectors and then the supporting subsectors of sort of everything else. And then as we move forward 20 years, you can see the size of this pie overall has grown enormously. 85% bigger than it was just 20 years ago. But the relative proportions between core and supporting, it's still roughly a 4-to-1 ratio, and that hasn't changed much. In both cases, it's about 21% of the overall arts and culture sector in the ACPSA data is in the core, and the other 79% is in the supporting. That didn't change much in the last 20 years. But what goes on inside each of these two wedges has changed a lot in the last 20 years. So to help visualize that, got a little bar graph here that'll break down the core subsectors as their sort of share, their sort of market share, the share of the core subsectors as contributed by these different subsectors that are in the core arts. And each of these contributes a bit, so advertising here is a little bit more than 20% of the total value added in the core arts. Independent artists, writers, and performers, this orange block is the next one in terms of size, then architecture, promoters, and so on. And if you compare the 2021 composition to the 2001, first it's worth noting, all of these bars in real terms grew larger. But in terms of their share, they didn't all stay the same. Some of them are gaining in share and some are declining. In a sense, some of them are growing faster than the average core arts economy, and some are growing a bit slower. And some of the more noticeable changes is to see the relative growth, the absolute and relative growth in the independent artists, writers, and performers piece, the absolute and relative growth in the promoters, in interior design, but those are offset by relative declines in architecture, graphic design, photography, and performing arts. If we do this again for the supporting arts, the supporting subsectors, we see something that's much more dramatic in terms of the change. So broadcasting ends up being the largest section in 2021, followed by other information services, an orange bar that was almost unnoticeable some 20 years ago. And other information services here now has the things like streaming and other web services and IT pieces that for many of us has come to define what arts and culture is in modern America. Back in 2001, it wasn't such a big part of the supporting industry, but you can see even more dramatic shifts in how we compose the supporting arts sector from 2001 to 2021, where broadcasting, especially other information services, publishing, these have grown in size, but other things like government, sound recording, motion pictures, their share of the supporting arts piece, of the arts and culture economy has shrunk. So the storylines, when I look at all this data, first, the arts and culture economy here is certainly resilient. It bounced back stronger than it was in the pre-pandemic years, and it's been led by these core subsectors, these creative, most essentially creative piece. Overall, over the last 20 years, the ACPSA data show that arts employment's been declining. It's not even holding flat compared to where we were 20 years ago. As we just saw, there's been major changes in the makeup of the arts and culture sector over the past 2 decades. And I think the most interesting to me bottom line of the analysis is that it's the state's arts and culture economies that are actually modestly driving overall economic growth at the state level. This kind of effect is one where if you can grow your state's arts and culture economy, that's going to drive the next year of positive growth in the overall economy, as well as additional growth in the arts and culture sector in the following year. So states that are growing their arts and culture sector are the ones that have been growing it in subsequent years as well. The rich are getting richer in a sense. The other thing I showed is that it's the core arts rather than the supporting arts that's the catalyst or the driver for that overall economic growth, but also that core arts growth is driving growth in the supporting arts subsectors as well. And interestingly, the reverse does not apply. In the current data release from ACPSA, we don't see evidence that overall prosperity or overall gross state product growth is driving growth in the arts and culture sector. It's one direction at this point. So the last things I'll mention before we go into the conversation, I want to make sure to touch on a few things that I think it's worthwhile looking at all this great data, but to keep it in perspective. The ACPSA data is good at counting transactions and flows of dollars. That's not the art's best story. It's not even the art's best economic impact story, but it is what it is. And for what it does, it's really interesting. And I think we can learn a lot from it. And it's not that it's counting nothing, it's just not getting the whole picture. It's missing out on, for instance, the amount of time we spend, especially the unpaid time we invest in the arts and the benefits that it gives us from that. It's not measuring that. Just as we compare on those charts that Moshe showed, the size of the arts and culture sector, the agriculture sector, the fact that the agriculture sector is less than 1% of GDP doesn't mean that food's not important. And we wouldn't want to make the same kind of conclusions about whatever numbers are shown here for the arts and culture. That said, we'll get into, I think, in the discussion, some of the pieces of the arts economy that are missing here. But I think it's worth emphasizing what we do see here. And we do see that the arts are actually faring better than the overall economy, even in recent years. At least this part of the arts economy is faring better than the overall economy. If you want to know how to grow the arts economy, one of the best ways to do it, apparently, is to grow the arts economy, in the sense that where places are growing well are the ones that are predicted to be growing even stronger in the future. And if you wanted to grow, say, the government subsector of the arts and culture sector, the best way to grow that is to promote overall economic growth at the state level. When the overall state economy booms, in the subsequent years, the government subsector tends to grow as well. And the last thing I'll underline before I hit mute is that I think it's important to appreciate how much of this is a rapidly evolving sector of the economy. The pandemic accelerated some of these changes, but we are seeing pretty radical shifts in terms of what makes up the arts and culture economy in a pretty short period of time. And that makes this for some sort of dizzying challenges. But one thing that also comes out of the data is that despite this rapid evolution, I think the core value of the creative piece of the arts and culture sector as the main driver has remained. That part is stable, even though it might take a different form from year over year. The creative core parts of the arts economy are where we see the most important engine there. And that's, I think, an interesting result and an interesting bit of consistency. So with that, I'll turn it back over to Ron.
Great. Thanks so much, Doug. Indeed, fascinating stuff. And it's great to get an overview of the research and learn some of these key takeaways. And now I think we can discuss some of this in further detail, and we can bring in Sunil Iyengar from the NEA. Hi, Sunil. And yeah, just to get us started off with our discussion, I just wanted to ask if there's, anything that surprised you about this research. And Sunil, I'll start with you.
Yeah, great. Well, first of all, it's great to be here and to hear Doug at work. I have to say, when we cultivated this account with the Bureau of Economic Analysis, and certainly working with your amazing team, Ryan, at NASAA, to make this more available to the states and more useful, these data, we really were envisioning that making these data available to researchers as well as practitioners, and to really bring their own innovative approaches to studying it, so that there isn't necessarily, to use the term Doug used, a monolithic way of approaching it. And so we, in fact, are really grateful that Doug was able to apply his own ingenuity to look at this. And so to answer your question, I will say that I was surprised by a couple of things in a big way. One was the finding, which seems fairly unambiguous, about the causal effect or the causal link between state arts economic growth and overall economic growth in the states. That was not something I was expecting or had anticipated would be studied with these data. So it was really quite revealing to see that, even with all the caveats that attend that statement. I will say there's another thing that surprised me here, and it's in the report. And Doug, you mentioned it a little bit, but the reverse was not found. So in fact, particularly as we come out of COVID, to see that the impact of the downturns in the economy, if I got this right, did not directly cause the arts economies downturns, or you didn't see that kind of direct linkage that you saw, with the arts economy on the other, on the other hand, affecting the state economies. And why that's important, I thought Doug did a great job in the report of talking about the diversification of arts economies. He went into it a little bit here with, he always brings a new perspective. So this wasn't in the report, but he went through just now the sort of color band thing, the spectrum of all those different industries, and showed 2021 versus 2001, the shrinking or the growing, appearance of those in those years. And I think we have to always keep in mind the relative strength of these different sectors in a given state and what that does. So it's not one size fits all, as he said. But I think what I take away from the fact that the causal inference is one way, so to speak, is that the diversity of these state economies play a great deal to buffer against these economic downturns, and that there is true resilience occurring. So that was quite remarkable, both the fact that there's a causal linkage and also that that it seems to be abetted by the diversification of these state economies. And in sort of reminds me of what mutual funds investors say all the time about investing in your 401k, right? Keep it kind of spread out so that you're not overly reliant on a single industry.
Great, thanks, Sunil. And I also just wanted to point out in the chat, Sunil's great blog post that talks about some of this research is linked in the chat now as well. And Doug, as the researcher, what stuck out to you or surprised you?
Yeah, well, similar stuff to what Sunil says, for sure. And I think the diversification piece is big here, because I was a bit surprised at how the data didn't show the arts and culture sector cratering in 2020, that it didn't get hit as severely in this data as the sort of narratives and I think a lot of people's experiences were. And I think that's in part because the arts and culture sector is actually much bigger than the ACPSA data, and the parts that the ACPSA data cover were not apparently hit as hard. It's got the streaming and the digital part and some of the things that actually compensated for big losses elsewhere. But the biggest thing that surprised me, this is one that Sunil said, is that there was a significant causal positive effect of arts and culture on overall state economic growth. And part of the reason this surprised me, in theory, this is possible. It's a story a lot of people have been telling and trying to tell for a while. But I looked at the ACPSA data back when it only went through 2019. And doing the same analysis, the result didn't show that significant result that we see today. So adding 2 more years of data has strengthened the trends enough that it's now statistically significant and stronger, which tells me something happened in 2020 and 2021 to really solidify and strengthen this effect that we're able to now detect. And I think that's an important part to keep in mind about the positive story of the arts and culture driving economic growth at the state. The 2020 story is one of negative growth, of decline for the arts and culture sector. And what this data tells us is that the states that got hit the hardest in 2020 were the states that had the worst economic rebound in their overall economy in 2021. And that effect was strong enough to actually change these results from the last time I looked. So I was a bit surprised, but I think that's a really telling, and it's the flip side of this coin way of looking at it. It's sort of, no way, it cuts both ways. It's not just that growth in the arts economy helps grow your state's economy. Declines in your arts economy should bring your state's overall economy down. And apparently we're seeing that in pretty strong order. And I was a bit surprised to see it be quite that strong.
Indeed, and I think those are, similar to what surprised me when we first heard about the results of your research, Doug, and, surprised in a good way. And I think, it's sometimes hard to communicate that this is a really big, this is a big deal, right? If you're taking these findings at face value, that the economies of arts and culture help propel state economies, and that the work that many of us are doing is contributing to that. I also think, based on part of what your comments were, Doug, is that the core arts being a significant driver of that, and that thinking of creativity as a renewable and inexhaustible resource that can drive economic well-being is a pretty big deal. So this is great, and there's some positive, really positive findings here in this research, but there's also this question about what do we do about it? And that's a difficult question. We may not know those answers completely, but I'm wondering if you have thoughts on how do we maximize the economic benefits of the arts and culture, knowing what we know from this research. Doug, mind to take that question first?
Sure. Well, so based on this research, I think the first thing to do is grow the core. The best way to sort of maximize these economic benefits, arts and culture, is to invest in, grow, and build those core subsectors of the arts and culture. And I think the other lesson that comes out of this is to embrace change. As the sector is evolving and will continue to evolve, especially with the advent of other new technologies and other changes in tastes, it's to go with that flow and let that taste, the change that's happened is the dynamic that's driving this. And so embrace that dynamic and go with it. I would also caution, as the sort of arm's length researcher on all of this, I'd say enjoy the win here. Take the really good news from this, but don't lose sight of arts and culture's other main benefits that it provides. And so to maximize the economic benefits of the arts and culture is to say, take this bit, use this, but then also look for the other ways that it does still provide real economic benefits. And then the last thing I'd mention about sort of maximizing the benefits and what this study can tell me is the way to grow the core arts in the States, according to this data, is to have a history of growing the core arts. And I think there should be some attention paid to the being able to seed areas, whether it's geographic areas or subsectors where arts and culture seems to be lagging. And I think this is an important thing to be mindful of, the possibility that larger markets just attract more and more of the growth, and to be mindful to not let things get so concentrated, and to be thinking very purposefully about how to grow the arts and get the economic benefits where they're not historically already growing.
Yeah, I agree with that. And I would say that, it's in some ways a very good diagnostic tool, the data over time, because you can attend to gaps in a given state and see, obviously mind the core, I guess is the byline here, but I mean, is the watchword here. But at the same time, there are other gaps and niches where there may be opportunities for economic development that, capitalize on unique assets of a given state. So, I mean, it's essentially saying what Doug said. But the thing I would add also is that, trying where possible to align economic and job opportunities with these findings. So encouraging broad, inclusive participation in this creative economy in each of these states through workforce, education programs, those kinds of things, and doing it in a deliberative kind of systems way so that we realize that we're talking about the long-term viability of these microeconomies and how to do that through jobs programs, through apprentice programs, through strategies. I mean, I thought the finding about employment still being behind, and our 2022 data came out and it shows that there's some catch up for sure, but yeah, there's still some sectors some arts industries that are still lagging, and there's some that are way behind still. And so I think there's still some opportunities there as well on the job front to do kind of work policies, work programs and investments in that.
Great. So, I mean, one thing that I'm taking away from your comments here is that, like the arts diversify overall state economies, there are ways that we can diversify how we talk about the arts, not just from an economic perspective, from the multiple perspectives, and it's good to grow the various sectors within the economy to strengthen the overall arts economy. But also, as many of us here are working in the public sector, we obviously sometimes have this tension of understanding what sort of dollars going in through state arts agencies or other public entities, and how those contribute to the overall arts economy. I think it's hard to put those, to understand that, especially on a one-to-one basis. But I think we can talk about how the public sector plays a role in this overall economy. And so I wanted to ask you all to, or Doug and Sunil, to reflect on that, how you think the public sector plays a role. And whoever wants to
Can I jump in?
Yes.
Just because I'm itching to kind of double down, if you will, on stuff that Doug said about, well, let me put it this way. I think, especially since we're talking about the public sector, a lot of times economic growth can't be seen as the ultimate yardstick, and it shouldn't be, right? And in a sense, what the nonprofit sector is doing, public funding in a lot of cases, it's really trying to obviously care for a part of the ecosystem that the market overlooks, right? So we have to be cognizant of that. So I think that's very evident when you see dramatic growth, as it's been for years now, in web streaming, web publishing, those kinds of industries, which we know are largely commercial. Or if you look at publishing, or if you look at broadcasting, a lot of those are largely commercial. And that's great in that, there's growth there that is affecting the overall arts economy, and therefore we believe now through Doug's research affecting these individual state economies, and that's wonderful. But we also have to recognize, what is it that we can, how to kind of keep this one narrative in mind alongside with what was described earlier, the lived experience of a lot of artists, arts workers, arts organizations, and that are suffering and have been suffering and maybe still are not out of the woods. So that is a difficult kind of thing to keep in mind, to sort of keep those two sometimes contrasting narratives in mind. But I do think there's a way to do that when we realize that we just need to have a better grasp of how the nonprofit, I would put forward, nonprofit sector sits with or is nested within that satellite account data, and that we don't unfortunately have a way of right now disaggregating that through the BA data alone. We can look through other sources for that. But I would like to end my answer to your question by throwing down a challenge, not to you necessarily, Doug, but to you and your kind, I guess, researchers, cultural economists. I would love to see a really well-designed study that traces how nonprofit organizations, arts organizations, and that would include public funders like state arts agencies, how they contribute directly to the kinds of innovation and economic growth that we're seeing in the commercial sector, specifically in the commercial, some of these industries we mentioned. And I don't know, I haven't been able to really find the ideal study, but I know that there's a lot of research out there about the relationship between the nonprofit and the for-profit sector when it comes to the arts. I'd be curious if you had any thoughts on that.
It's a great challenge. I appreciate the challenge also, Sunil. I think me and my kind deserve and need to be challenged. And we need to get good, the challenging questions should come from people such as those on this Zoom call, and probably not from people down the hallway from me necessarily. So this is great. I think that is a big challenge. I would, to answer Ryan's last sort of prompt question, I would unfortunately just wanted to say ditto. And I don't need to take up any more time. I think Sunil nailed a lot of it. I think one tricky part to keep in mind is if there's this two parts of an arts economy, the one that ACPSA is capturing and then the rest of it, maybe that's something for us to be on the public sector side to be looking at is how can we better get the growth and gains in the ACPSA side to translate over, to spill over, to feed in and infuse the rest of the arts economy. And we know that there's overlaps between the nonprofit and the commercial, and right, they mutually reinforce each other to different degrees. And to the extent we can improve the support that goes and the spillover outside to the non-commercial and nonprofit, maybe that's someplace to be paying extra attention to.
Well, I know we don't have someone from the Bureau of Economic Analysis on the call on this, but I know, and not sort of to channel them in our conversations over the years, I mean, I think they would contend that the ACPSA does have all those, that all that is reflected, that whatever we're calling arts and culture and all the methodologies we've developed, it's reflecting the total arts and cultural footprint. However, it's impossible right now to disaggregate and disentangle or see whole the segment of that we're talking about, or the informal arts sector. But I don't know, do you agree with that? Or, I mean, I'm not putting that on them, but that's some of what I've heard.
I'm glad they say it. I appreciate it. I don't agree, but that's okay. I mean, I think they're capturing a lot in this data, and I think it's great for that. But when, down the street at the local park, if they're going to have the jazz trio play every Wednesday night, and a bunch of people come out of their homes and sit in the park and enjoy it, the ACPSA is not capturing that, and that's I think where a lot of the nonprofit world works, in places where ticket prices are not a great, or payroll is not a great measure of the value of what's actually happening there. Similarly, I can pay for a data plan for my phone, and we don't know what those gigabytes are going for. I'm paying a flat monthly fee, but I could be downloading and enjoying an enormous amount of arts and culture there, and the dollar transaction isn't really reflecting a lot of that. And that's just to say, I think there's a lot more out there, and I think we all know it.
Yeah, I agree with you. Yeah. I mean, insofar, for example, one of the things we know about this is it does not capture the wages, or sorry, the pay for self-employed workers, for example, and artists. So that's not reflected. They will say that, though, that it's reflected in the economic output, but it's not reflected in the actual employment numbers.
Right, and that's probably where you see relatively flat employment over the last 20 years, but a massive increase in the total amount of value added from the sector. So either artists have gotten incredibly more productive over the last two decades, or we're just not counting all of those workers anymore, because many of them, the rise of the gig economy and more workers in these other positions that aren't being measured or being missed, their output is still being measured, but not their input.
Yeah, and I think this is leading into another question that we have. So we might just skip the planned next question and go back to it. But this question around that the ACPSA doesn't capture all arts activities, and there are some limitations to what can be captured and classified. So, Doug's example of the jazz trio, I think there's also things such as that are not even associated with the nonprofit sector, or not even measurable among nonprofits that may not have revenues beyond volunteers, right? So just dollar amounts that may not be capturable, arts activities that are taking place that may not have any sort of economic output to them, but do have some value. We know that's a huge part of what happens. So when you think about the utility of the data and the robust information that we have, we can always pick holes at any study or data source of not being fully complete. But if we think about what we have, and also what we don't have, how do we want to describe those things? And so I guess, in other words, the data is very powerful. It doesn't tell us everything that we'd potentially like to know. And how do you think about these limitations? And maybe how would you suggest people get the most out of what we do have? And whomever would like to start.
I'll jump in. The first short answer is, I think this data can be exceedingly useful for benchmarking, essentially. I think Sunil mentioned that in his earlier comments, that benchmarking, whether it's your state against another state, your state in 2007 against your state in 2017, one subsector against another one, these benchmarking things where you're comparing within the data set, apples to apple, is really straightforward and very effective and powerful. You can punch holes in any data set or any study all day, and I try to focus on the positives and the sort of strength you can take away with. And I think the best strength of this data is it's sort of gold standard federal level data set quality. It's going to hold up in a lot of conversations in mixed company as being very valid data points. And it speaks to things like gross domestic product or gross state product, these big numbers that people throw around all the time. Whether they should or they shouldn't is a different story. But this is a great bit of data that sort of gets you that seat at the table and puts you in that conversation. And whether you're benchmarking arts and culture against agriculture or whatever, I think some of its best value is that it's speaking in the right language for a lot of these conversations. And so I would leverage that as a user of the data. And the last thing I would say on this is that I think some of its best value is looking at the relative sizes of the supporting arts versus the core arts. You give a grant, give $1 million to something in the core arts, but we know the supporting arts sector is 4 times as large. That money doesn't just sit in the artist's studio. The artist studio then takes the money and spends it on the other things that are in that supporting sector. It helps you paint the picture of how much bigger the arts economy is than just a lonely artist in a studio or a stage on Main Street. It's supporting out and rippling out much wider. And this puts some concreteness to that story in a nice quantitative way. And so I think that's really a useful part of the data as well.
Well, I was hoping for some more controversy and debates, because we seem to be in agreement on most of this stuff. I would say, actually, seriously, Doug, I agree with that. I think I think a lot of what we do in our own way, and the Office of Research and Analysis at the NEA, but Doug and his colleagues certainly, is really make the invisible visible, in terms of really showing that, look, the arts do count as a sector. Now, that might seem, to this group, that might seem really old news, but I think it's continually finding different terminologies and different currency to talk about the arts in ways that resonate with different types of audiences and are legitimate and authentic. So clearly, we would not take a conversation about the arts contributions to GDP to, or we may not necessarily take it to, a conversation about, maybe some other dimension of the arts, or the arts having to do with, say, health or something like that. These are for sort of a circumscribed purpose. But within that boundary, those boundaries, I think you can do an awful lot with the data and share out and speak with shoulder to shoulder with other kinds of industry analysts and representatives about what this sector is doing relative to other sectors. So I think that does have a definite value, is sort of the lingua franca of a lot of the economy speak at the state level. I would also say that we, what we try to do, and I think this is important, is look at other ways of measuring and other ways of knowing through our research. So even just looking at federal data, we can look at occupational data, and we can get numbers on things like self-employed workers or self-employed artists. We may not be able to then connect it back to GDP, but we can get things like how much they earned or what their median income is, and provide estimates that way. Or we can look at arts participation. Many of you know we collect data on that at the state level to know how many people are actually doing some informal and formal types of arts activities in any given state for that given year. So there's a lot of other ancillary data sources, and I think together they complement each other, and they can create a much more powerful narrative. I'll say that we launched, I guess earlier this month, Ryan was there with me, a new resource on the NEA website. It's called the National Arts Statistics and Evidence Reporting Center, which is a mouthful, but it is basically an online hub to access various arts indicators that we collect or measure at the national level, again, to give benchmarks for various things, including GDP, but also other dimensions of the arts that people may be interested in tracking over time.
Great. So I know that we're getting up against time here, but maybe get to one more question and then hopefully squeeze in an audience question. But so I know we had another question about some of the apparent diverging narratives that we might hear about the arts economy continuing to grow, but we still see certain industries, especially performing arts, struggling post-pandemic. Doug, I think you pointed that out somewhat within your findings, but I guess just give us a chance to speak to that. And Doug, if you don't mind going first.
Sure. Yeah, I think so. These are, in a sense, large aggregated or general patterns in the data, but just as each state has its own experience, each of the different subsectors may follow a different path. And so, and any one city might have a different story. So in some ways, I think the sort of positive, strong economic growth and resilience story that we see in general is an even more profound result when you realize that not everything has got a rosy story, and that it's got that sort of strong result despite some of the sectors, such as performing arts groups, having a really rough go of it in the last several years. And so this shouldn't be taken to sort of deny or reject those kinds stories, narratives, or realities. They're there, and it turns out the growth in other areas like streaming is outweighing, and it's probably not even coincidental that these are substitutes for one another in some ways. And so there's a big shift there, and with tastes and technology are shifting, we've got some realities to contend with in the sector. And the question of sort of how much do we roll with it and adapt and leverage those changes, or how much do we resist and fight and try to maintain what the status quo looked like in 2018? Those are open questions. And I think the other thing I'd mention is that there may be some blind spots in the data, in particular for more non-commercial sorts of activities and for the self-employed types of things, where it's failing to grasp some of the challenges that are certainly present.
Great.
Yeah, there is an industry in this account known as independent writers, artists, and performers. And what that really is apparently, if you're an artist and you hire someone on payroll, if you have someone on payroll, then you count. So clearly, there's a lot of superstars in there, but also some more boutique and other types of artists that you may not, that or small operations as well. But it's hard to, you really need more understanding of the granular. We need more understanding of the granular distinctions within these industries to really make those kinds of sweeping pronouncements about, to know truly whether a particular sector is healthy or not in the broadest sense. I mean, I think we have some really good data here that tell us, exactly how the sector did over that period. But I think we could use a lot more, specifically around wages. I think between wages and productivity, that contrast you just pointed out, Doug, I think is really important. Suddenly this superb, at least it seems like, and we've said the highest growth, we've seen in years and years occurring over the post-pandemic period, and yet a stagnancy when you look at employment. And what does that mean in terms of inflation, how jobs and wages have been holding up throughout inflation? We should know more about, I think, particularly the performing arts sector, how they've been doing, not only in terms of keeping the doors open and getting audiences, which is something we're looking into, but also how workers have fared throughout that period, and what has happened to their wages relative to, or their earnings relative to the productivity that we report from these industries.
Great. So I know we are just about up against time, and I just wanted to maybe I can encapsulate the question from Miguel. So let's say, regardless of all the data that's collected by the BEA, would you have any suggestions for something that an arts grant maker, like a state arts agency, that could collect, regardless of what's required to collect, that would help fill in some of this picture? Any thoughts, Doug or Sunil?
I'll just say I'm a big fan, especially lately, of cultural asset mapping, to really have a good grasp of what does culture look like in your community. I mean, this is going to sound really broad, but you probably know there have been a lot of researchers, even in ethnography, where they look at places, sites of what Mark Stern from the University of Pennsylvania has called naturally occurring cultural districts, or, where these activities naturally occur throughout informal arts activities as well as formal arts activities. I think state arts leaders, and certainly at the local level, are uniquely poised to really drill down into those areas and really map. And I don't mean necessarily geographically, although that's a big part of it too, but just inventory, if you will, what's going on in your communities, so that we can then reflect that back on this national data or the state level data that we report, the feds report, to understand, well, actually, we find an area of a corridor that's very vibrant and that's, generating tremendous, we believe has a strong economic impact, that then you could maybe engage someone to study relative to what we're finding at the national level with these aggregate numbers. But I do feel a lot of it comes down to a better taxonomy for understanding how culture shows up in your communities.
And I'll complement Sunil's answer about sort of assets by saying I would try to be tracking more and measuring more on activities, and how people spend their day and their time is a big deal. Volunteer time being spent with nonprofits, the amount of time and ways people spend their own scarce resource, their day on arts and culture. If you can better capture that, you're way ahead of a lot of other sectors and a lot of other industries where there's not a lot of volunteer work going on in the automotive repair industry, right? But there is a lot of volunteer work going on in the arts and culture.
Yeah, and then to Doug's point, that could actually be monetized. I mean, volunteer organizations do that all the time. Here's how much, if you could monetize this work, here's what it would translate to in terms of economic gains. I mean, that's not too hard to do. So I think it's something that would be great for all of us to track for nonprofit, for volunteer, and civic engagement work.
Yeah, so I guess we could say, sort of like politics, all data is local or are local and useful at the local level, most meaningfully. So with that, we're a couple of minutes over time. Appreciate everybody for sticking around with us, and just special thanks to Moshe, Doug, and Sunil, and also Eric for helping us get organized here. And also, special thanks to Sunil for his work in allowing us to have this great data from the BEA through the partnership with NEA. And thanks to Doug for, again, updating his research and giving us, I think, some really important tools to communicate about the very strong economic value of the arts to our communities. So thanks again, and appreciate everyone. We will see you next time.